Hello everyone, today we are going back to Alabama death row to see all the inmates that are currently waiting for their execution, what crimes they committed and how much time they spent so far behind bars. Michael Carruth, 20 years on death row. He was convicted along with another man for the murder of 12-year-old Brett Boyer. They shot him 3 times in the head and they cut his father's throat, then buried the man in a shallow grave from which he managed to dig himself out and call for help. Forrest Boyer dragged himself to a nearby road and insisted his kid was treated first, even if the cut he had was year to year.
1021. Okay, sir, you got any idea what's your name? Come here. The ambulance is here, sir. Hold on. Right there.
My boys were shot 3 times.
Okay, hold on, sir. Hold on. All right. Hold on, sir. Hold on. Okay, ambulance is here.
I'll get my boys first.
All right. All right, sir, hold on real quick. What's your name? Butch what?
Warrior.
Sir, who did this?
Jim Brooks.
Brooks?
It's not Jim. It's not a dad. It's a son. You thought I know who he was.
Let's see what you got. Hey, Lon. No bullshit. I got a man, his throat's been cut to hell. He said his son's been shot 3 times, is buried in a grave down here at Uchi, and he wants to go get him. He was buried and dug himself out. This is a bad one. This guy's throat is cut to hell.
The 2 criminals had posed as police officers, and this was all an attempt to rob the victim. This was not the only conviction they got, however. They were also charged with murdering Thurman Ray Ratliff, 68 years old, and Catherine Combs Ratliff, 62 years old. Carruth is now 65 years old. James Edward Barber, 19 years on death row. Barber was convicted for murdering Dorothy Epps, a 75-year-old lady who he had known for the majority of his life. He was in fact her handyman and was very often in contact with the victim before deciding to rob her. At the time, her husband was out of town and he told the neighbors to keep an eye on his wife in case she needed anything. Barber killed Dorothy with a hammer and his palm print was found at the crime scene. He is now 64 years old. Charlie Washington, 19 years on death row. He was sentenced to death for the murder of Julian and Florence McKinnon, a couple for which he had worked as a handyman. Julian McKinnon had just closed the sale for a piece of property land that he owned, and Washington was the one that drove him to meet the buyer that day. During the night, Washington entered the couple's house and murdered them with the intent of robbing them. Washington is now 75 years old. Jimmy Lee Brooks, 19 years on death row. Brooks was the second man involved in the murder of 12-year-old Brett Boyer along with Carruth Michael. His lawyers argue that he does not deserve to die because he did not plan on ending the life of the little boy and because he is showing remorse. Brooks is now 44 years old. James Ben Brownfield, 19 years on death row. He was convicted for the murder of his sister, Brenda McCutcheon, her husband, Latham McCutcheon, and his sister's 3-year-old grandson, Joshua Hodges. Brownfield consumed Xanax pills on December 23, 2001, became enraged with his sister over drugs and money, then killed her and Joshua with a claw hammer. Brenda McCutcheon suffered approximately 20 blows to the head and other injuries to her body. Joshua suffered approximately 16 blows to the head and, of course, other injuries to his body as well. They both died from multiple blunt force injuries. Brownfield traveled across town to her estranged husband's house after killing Brenda and Joshua, pretending it was a friendly visit to obtain entry, and then struck him with his fists and the hammer. Latham McCutcheon received 10 powerful hits to the skull from the claw hammer, among other injuries. Then Brownfield used a knife to slit his throat and stab him in the heart. He is now 49 years old. Antonio Jones, 19 years on death row. Jones was convicted for the murder of Ruth Kirkland, an 80-year-old woman. The victim drove her 1990 white Cadillac to the grocery store in the afternoon of December 31, 1999, to buy some items that she was missing. Mrs. Kirkland, a tiny woman who had suffered a stroke and had been living alone since the death of her husband, was left with a limp and a weak right arm. She also needed a walker or cane to go around. Mrs. Kirkland kept money at her home, which was widely known in the neighborhood. She had to make numerous trips inside to bring her goods, and by the time she was finished, it was getting dark. In the end, she just left the remaining of the groceries in the car overnight, because she did not like being outside after dark. When Antonio Jones arrived at Mrs. Kirkland's home later, he shut off the circuit breakers outside before entering. The police were unable to tell from the evidence whether Jones forced entry or whether Miss Kirkland unlocked the door to check on the power outage, allowing Jones to enter freely. Mrs. Kirkland tried to defend herself, but Jones kicked and beat her. She fought back against Jones's attacks. She fractured both of her wrists. She was brutally beaten by Jones, who also used one of her walking canes and a broken chair leg in addition to his hands and feet. Mrs. Kirkland's broken cane and bloody spatters were discovered throughout the house, as well as several rooms. Jones ransacked the house looking for the money that she supposedly kept hidden, then he took her car and fled the scene. Mrs. Kirkland was found later in the night by her grandson, who was a police officer. Jones is now 42 years old. Michael Brown, 19 years on death row. Betty Kirkpatrick, 65 years old, was found dead in her mobile home in Hueytown in October 12, 2001 by Ricky Kirkpatrick, her son, and his wife. Her throat had been slit, and she had a garbage bag covering her head. On her chest were a paper towel and a knife. Both Betty Kirkpatrick's pocketbook and her 1986 gold Ford Thunderbird were gone. According to the testimony of the forensic pathologist, Betty Kirkpatrick perished from asphyxia by strangling and smothering. Brown was seen driving her car around, and many people testified that he had actually described the murder to them. He is now 46 years old. BRANDYN Benjamin, 19 years on death row. He was convicted for murdering Jimmy Lewis with the purpose of robbing him. On the evening of November 18, 2000, about 9 p.m., Jimmy Lewis went to the Wiregrass Commons Mall to pick up his wife, who ran a store there. Because it was raining outside, he decided to return to the car that was parked rather far from the entry to bring the automobile closer for when his wife exited the mall. Benjamin had specifically gone to the mall in search of a victim to rob. He parked his car in a spot that wouldn't attract attention and kept an eye on mall security to see how frequently they made rounds. Benjamin showed up as Jimmy Lewis walked toward his car and allegedly demanded the victim's wallet. After a short struggle, he shot the victim twice, once in the leg and once in the chest, and beat him several times. After taking the victim's wallet and its contents, the criminal fled the scene. When the police and paramedics eventually arrived, the victim had already passed away. Benjamin is now 43 years old. MOHAMMAD SHARIFI, 18 years on death row. Iranian national MOHAMMAD SHARIFI arrived in Huntsville in December 1998 with a 6-month tourist visa. He married American citizen Sarah K. Smith just before the visa ran out. Sharifi and Sarah split up in late 1999. After that, Sarah and Derek Brown went to the Immigration and Naturalization Service to meet with Sharifi's caseworker. Sharifi's petition to become a legal alien was rejected as a result of the meeting. On December 6, 1999, Sharifi purchased a pistol. Invading the flat he had shared with Sarah on December 13, 1999, Sharifi was forcibly removed from the flat with only his clothes after the Huntsville police were summoned to the incident. Sharifi fled with a promise to come back. Sarah replaced the locks on the apartment's doors after Sharifi left. But later that day, he returned, and he was furious to see that the locks had been changed. When Sharifi discovered Derek Brown was in the apartment, despite though he was not permitted to be there, he became even more upset. The last time anyone saw Sarah and Brown alive was on December 13, 1999. Sarah's body was discovered on the Tennessee River's banks on December 26, 1999. It had been wrapped in black plastic bags and secured with an electrical cord. Brown's body was discovered partially wrapped in black plastic bags and tied with an electrical cord in the Tennessee River on January 1, 2000. Brown and Sarah both received head injuries from gunfire. Following forensic investigations, it was established that the weapon Sharifi bought on December 1999 was the one used to shoot both victims. Sharifi is now 57 years old. Christopher Shane Hyde, 18 years on death row. 3 people were killed during a hold-up at a small-town funeral home, and a man who was only 4 months out of prison in Florida after serving time for attempting to kill someone during a robbery has been charged with capital murder. Christopher Shane Hyde was detained in connection with the deaths of 2 employees and the driver for a casket firm at Bell Funeral Home thanks to a tip from a witness. Together with the funeral home's manager, June Williams, 61 years old, Rick Peterson, 50 years old, served as the pastor of the Faith Worship Center in Summiton. Authorities said that Randall Lane, 66 years old, a semi-retired manager of a casket company, was making a delivery when all three of them were fatally shot. A few hours after the murder, police detained Hyde as he boarded a bus from Birmingham to Atlanta. After the murders, a relative drove Hyde to Birmingham, but it seems like they had no idea what had transpired. He is now 51 years old. Ondra Marshall, 18 years on death row. The deaths of Clarence Kyle, 48 years old, and his wife Allison, 38 years old, in February 2004, led to the conviction of Ondra Marshall for capital murder. According to prosecution testimony, Marshall battered, shackled, and shoved the victims into a car trunk before dousing them with gasoline and setting the vehicle on fire. It seems like the motive was a drug debt. Marshall is now 50 years old. Dion Eatman, 18 years on death row. He participated in the kidnapping of Clarence and Allison Kyle along with Ondra Marshall. He is now 46 years old. Wesley Devon Harris, 18 years on death row. Harris terrorized and murdered his girlfriend's grandmother, parents, and 3 teenage brothers. 65-year-old Mila Ruth Ball was the matriarch of a family that resided on a farm near Moody's Crossroad, Crenshaw County. Joanne, her 35-year-old daughter, and Willie Haslip, 40-year-old, shared a trailer on the family farm where they raised their 3 kids, Jerry Ball, 19 years old, Tony Ball, 17 years old, and Joni Ball, 14 years old. Janice Ball, a 16-year-old daughter of Joanne and Willie, shared the farmhouse with her grandmother, Mila. When Janice first met Harris, he was 19 years old and she was just 14. Janice fell pregnant 3 months after the two first met, and they had a daughter, Nashay, whom they called Shay. According to Janice's testimony, she barely saw Harris after telling him she was pregnant until Shay was born. Then, she and Harris shared a trailer in Laverne. Janice claimed that Harris turned aggressive, at which point she returned to the farm and lived with her grandmother. After a fight with the entire family, Harris decided to murder everyone except Janice and Shay, and that's exactly what he did. He shot them all, one by one, starting with the grandmother and continuing with the brothers and parents. He then took Janice and his daughter, as well as the family dog, to a 3-day trip in which they visited multiple friends of his. Eventually, Harris's aunt persuaded him to turn himself over to the authorities. While her entire family was being murdered, Janice was threatened by the father of her child to stay quiet and not warn anybody, because if she did, he would shoot her as well. I cannot imagine the terror and heartbreak she had to go through. This was absolutely horrible. Harris is now 43 years old. KERRY Spencer, 18 years on death row. He was convicted, along with Nathaniel Woods, for the murder of 3 police officers in 2004. The officers, Carlos Owen, 58 years old, Harley Chisholm, 40 years old, and Charles Bennett, 33 years old, were shot dead when they approached the house in which the 2 criminals were staying and allegedly dealing drugs. Nathaniel Woods was considered an accomplice. He got the death penalty and he was executed in 2020, and there was a lot of controversy revolving his punishment. In fact, KERRY Spencer had said multiple times that he was the one that killed the officers and that Woods had not participated in the crime, he was just there. Spencer is still waiting for his execution date to be set, even if he was convicted before Woods. He is now 43 years old. Devin Darnell Thompson. On the morning of June 3, 2003, at about 3 in the morning, Officer Crump and Officer Strickland approached a car parked in a nearby restaurant lot and discovered Thompson inside, asleep. The officers detained Thompson after the dispatcher notified them that the car had been stolen. While the police were registering Thompson, they learned that a dry cleaning shop nearby where the automobile had been stolen had been broken into, and its inventory of clothing had been stolen as well. At the scene of the burglary, a shoe print was found. In order to collect Thompson's fingerprints and the shoe print, the officers had to take off his handcuffs. Thompson shot Strickland in the head with a .40 caliber service handgun while the officer was trying to take his fingerprints. Thompson then moved down the hallway and fatally wounded Officer Crump. He then came upon Miller as he was making his way out of the police station. He repeatedly shot Miller before leaving the station. Thompson then drove off after stealing a police car. Later that day, close to Columbus, Mississippi, he was detained. Officer Strickland's weapon, which Thompson had stolen, was discovered in the police car. Thompson, a recent high school graduate, was never in trouble before and had no criminal history. At the end of the summer, he was supposed to report for duty in the Air Force. He is now 38 years old. That was all for part 2. We will continue with part 3 next week. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.